Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 106, we sit down with Joe McKay, a man whose journey has taken him from the streets of Astoria to the heart of the North Fork. He shares stories of his upbringing, his college years, and a career that spanned from the Army to labor relations, roles that shaped his perspective on work, service, and community. He reflects on life in New York City and the pivotal decision to settle on the East End, where he discovered New Suffolk and made it his home. Joe played a key role in preserving the character of New Suffolk, opening the New Suffolk Emporium, and working with the New Suffolk Waterfront Fund to fend off condo developments that threatened the area's charm. His civic engagement continued with the New Suffolk Civic Association, and later his move to Peconic Landing marked the start of yet another chapter, one of mentorship, teaching, and community building. As an ambassador at Peconic Landing, he remains an influential figure, shaping lives around him. In this conversation, we explore his lifelong commitment to community, his passion for writing and teaching, and his hopes for the future of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 106 with Joe McKay. This episode was recorded November 21st, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today.
Good. Well, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.
I love the North Fork. I love Greenport, so I'm happy to talk about it in any way you'd like.
Thank you. So could you give us a little introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised?
Yeah, I'm from Astoria in Queens, born and lived there until I went away to college. I went to Cornell. Then I worked most of my career in New York City, but I began coming out to the South Fork first, and then the North Fork on weekends, as so many people did, and eventually bought homes that were weekend homes mostly, and eventually then retired out here. So I retired to the North Fork full-time to New Suffolk in 1994. Yeah.
Okay.
But before that, I lived in South Jamesport as a weekender, had a small farm there, and then moved to New Suffolk. And then in 2002, moved to Peconic Landing as a
resident there.
As a resident there, and
You still had a place in New Suffolk?
And as a matter of fact, even when I sold my house there, I kept a cottage that had been rented before. And I kept it, and I go down there a couple of days a week now just to keep my friends and contacts there in New Suffolk. I don't know if you know New Suffolk, but it's a beautiful little place.
People have talked about it, but I've never actually been
really
over there. I've only passed through Cutchogue. I never go left or right to go down.
Take a left. It's only a mile, and it's another world.
Yes.
It is a different world, which is why it's very hard to give up my little cottage there. Where do you live?
In Greenport.
Good.
So
take a left.
I need to explore. And now, just to go back, in terms of your ancestry, how far back can you go on either of your parents' side?
Well, on my mother's side, she was an immigrant from, she's Irish, but she immigrated here in 1920 from Glasgow in Scotland. Her father was a manager for the Lipton Tea Company, and he had been transferred to Glasgow. So somewhere around 1908 or something like that, he was transferred to Glasgow. And so his brothers, his 5 brothers, had all begun to move to the States, particularly with the problems that were beginning to brew in Ireland, and that ended with the revolution in 1922. And so he moved his family here in 1920, and they came over and landed at Ellis Island. And my mother was a great storyteller, and so she was always telling us of her memories and of seeing a parade where King George marched by their store in Glasgow, and she was kind of always very happy about her Irish, British, Scottish roots, to the extent that they were roots. They weren't blood roots.
How old was she when she...
She was 10 when she came here. She was born in 1910. Yeah. So then they moved into Manhattan. And eventually they moved to Astoria in Queens. And she met my father when she was in her late 20s in Astoria. My father's family had been from Astoria for a while. He was the son, the oldest child, the son of a mother who was 1/4 Indian, American Indian, Iroquois, Mohawk specifically. And my father's father was from a very wealthy Irish family who lived on Park Avenue. But when he impregnated the chauffeur's daughter, who was the Indian woman, his family disowned him. So my father was born of a disowned father from a good family, and a American Indian woman her mother had been the children's librarian at New York Public Library on 42nd Street. But that bit of a credential and that bit of maternal history on her part wasn't enough to keep my father's family from not wanting anything to do with her and from disowning their son. So I grew up with that little bit of family ancestry, and they made for an interesting mix in my own head. Lots of, even to this day, I still trace down some of the stories of the Mohawks from the Mohawk Indians from upstate New York, and I'm very familiar with the fact that my great-grandmother was the children's librarian, because I started going there from Astoria as a kid, about 9. Every Saturday I spent at the children's library in the main public library at Fifth Avenue. So it's a nice little family history that I'm quite aware of, not obsessed with, but aware of and pleased with, because it made me a diverse kind of guy. I brought up intensely Catholic, but my parents left the church in a very formal way when I was 16. I mean, they actually wrote to the Pope and said they no longer believed what the Catholic Church was teaching. And so at first I was horrified because it had a social impact on me as a kid going to Catholic high school. But eventually I realized that caused me to be very open-minded. And so that's the other important part of my background.
And what did your parents specifically say why they left?
They came not to believe that Jesus really intended there to be this big bureaucracy that grew out in his wake, called the Catholic Church. So, they came not to believe that. By reading the Bible, Catholics I don't know if you're Catholic, but the Catholics aren't encouraged to read the Bible much. So they had to do some really studies. And because I had a couple of uncles who were priests, my parents were sent to Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, who was a big television star at the time in the 50s, and to have counseling. And it didn't change their opinions. They decided that the Catholic Church was just something that was attributed to Jesus, but he didn't really intend to have that kind of So all of this for me makes for interesting ancestry and legacy.
Yes. And then also just in terms of your dad's side, were they in the U.S. they had come over much earlier?
On his father's side, they had come in the 1860s. My great-grandfather, who was named Peter McKay, came in the 1860s as a little boy.
Did you get to meet any of your grandparents?
My maternal grandfather, yes, but he died when I was 3, but I remember him a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And my father's father also was around until I was, he was the disinherited one.
Mm-hmm.
He was around until I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew him. My grandmother's, no, neither one. My mother's mother died in Glasgow in childbirth for another child after her. And my father's mother died in 1936, a few years before I was born.
Okay. And now, what did your parents met in Astoria? I mean, grew up in that neighborhood.
They were, yes, my mother's family had moved to Astoria. My father was from there from the time he was born. Mm-hmm. And one Saturday night in 1937, they were both happened to be going to confession at St. Joseph's Parish Church. Mm-hmm. And my mother got there late. She was habitually late. And couldn't get in. It was a few minutes past 9 o'clock. She wanted to go to confession. So my father, gallant that he was, came along and saw that she was trying to knock on the door and get into the church. And he came up and pounded on the door heavily. I think they still didn't get in, but that's how they met.
And what did they do for work?
My mother worked, she had a high school education, but no more. She worked for different companies during the 20s and early 30s, different companies that, as she said, they kept going out of business because it was the Depression. But she always got another job because she was very, very smart and very good at what she did. And so she just did that. A lot of New York companies of different kinds, I think a lot in advertising and publishing. My father, when he graduated from Fordham in 1932, knowing that there were no jobs available for somebody at professional level, he went to the New York State Civil Service and did very well, always did well on the civil service exams, came out on top. So he started in 1932 or 33 at the New York State Insurance Fund. And by the time he retired in 1970, he had risen to the top of that. So he was there 38 years.
Okay. And then did you have any siblings?
I was the oldest of 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now for you, did you grow up all through Astoria as well?
I did.
And how would you describe the neighborhood or the environment there?
It was wonderful. I really liked it. It was I want to call it multi-ethnic, but it wouldn't be called multi-ethnic by today's standards. It was German, Italian, and Irish. And most of them first or second generation families, and mostly Catholic, and not entirely, but mostly Catholic.
Were the Greeks came later?
No, the Greeks were in Astoria, but in a section of Astoria.
A different section.
Yeah. Astoria runs from the East River all the way up to Woodside, which is a pretty good distance. So it was down near the East River that the Greeks were mostly concentrated then.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what activities would you do as a child? Even would you be outside quite a bit? And
I was outside all the time. I was outside all the time. I lived on a block in Astoria that were a block of 6 family houses that had been built in the mid-30s. And each of the 6 families in each house with, kids from those different ethnicities that I described, German, Irish, and Italian. And we played ball and skated in the streets, and there were schools nearby. We used their schoolyards for all of our jogging and playing ball. And And we played stickball in the streets too. It was a wonderful, really nice upbringing. The parish church, the same one where my parents had met, was how many blocks? About 8 blocks away. And so we walked back and forth to school twice a day. I was going to say something else about what I did as a kid. Astoria Park, which is right down there on the East River by the Hellgate Bridge, was a big thing in my life because beginning around the time I was, 8 or so, I was able to go down there in the summer times, and it was quite a distance, but I think we took a bus, sometimes walked, and I really swam every single day of my life, mostly at Astoria Pool, but sometimes even in the East River when it was high tide. Near where we were by the East River was low tide. The sewage plants emptied out, and so you wouldn't want to go in. But at high tide, it seemed clean enough. Probably not for my mother, but she didn't know.
Yes.
And then we also came out to Rocky Point, right here on the North Fork, or in from the North Fork a little bit. My grandfather owned a bungalow, and so we came out for several weeks every summer. And so I really also learned to swim in Long Island Sound. When I was very little, as my mother said, before you were born, you knew how to swim.
And now, where did you go for elementary and middle school?
I went to that parish school, St. Joseph's in Astoria. And when I graduated from there, I had won a scholarship to Bishop Loughlin Memorial High School in Brooklyn. That was a school that gave scholarships to 2 boys from each parish in Brooklyn, Queens, and Nassau. And so again, that was an opportunity for me to meet kids from all over as opposed just from my neighborhood. And so beginning in 1952, when I started there, I was really meeting kids from all over Western Long Island, from different backgrounds. And so I traveled around on subways and buses all through Queens and Brooklyn and Nassau. And by the time I graduated from high school, I was a person of the world, such as it was.
And was your schooling experience, how was that experience? And I guess even into high school, what were some of your favorite, even core classes or classes that you had?
Well, it's funny, because I was just talking about this at dinner last night with a fellow resident at Peconic Landing. I loved school. From the time I was a kid, I looked forward to these September days when we went back to school. I was a top student and a little goody two-shoes, nerdy kid. And even though I could run faster and swim better than anybody else, but I was still the teacher's pet. I was an altar boy. I was smart. So I was a pain in the ass to most people. But the thing I was telling this woman last night at dinner was that the one thing it felt to me, and I didn't learn it until I graduated from high school and went to Cornell, was that I was never really taught to think or encouraged to think. So I was very smart in terms of getting good marks. But pretty much it was memorization.
In terms of just thinking more outside of just that rigid, more creative thoughts.
Exactly. Not much creative, very little creative, and certainly not broad thinking that was encouraged to be my own take. If we did, which we began to do in the later grades of grammar school, if we did a paper, for example, we weren't asked to critique anything that we had read. We were asked to summarize, So I was good at that. But when I got to Cornell, the first year, within a month, I realized most other kids, they were thinking on their own. And I had never been encouraged to do that. So I've been catching up ever since.
And did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
I knew what I thought I wanted to do. And the reason I went to Cornell was I went into the agriculture school. Now, here's a dyed-in-the-wool New York City kid from Astoria who barely had a garden. But I wanted to go into the agriculture school in order to study soil science, which was called agronomy. The only thing that I had kind of slipped my mind was that really meant it was all chemistry. And I hated chemistry. So after 1 year, I switched at Cornell out of the agriculture school, which was a state school at Cornell and tuition free. And I couldn't stay at Cornell and afford it. So I switched to another tuition-free school at Cornell, which was the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And this time I looked more carefully at what that would entail course-wise. And it turns out it was a cross of psychology and business history. And that suited me fine. And so I graduated from there with that degree in industrial and labor relations.
And then also at that time, were you, because of you were thinking more the agriculture, Cornell seemed like a good option. You weren't thinking of staying within the New York City area.
I don't think I was thinking too much about it, to tell you the truth. While I was in school, I retained, by the way, my love for composting. And to this day, I still compost everything I can and put it in my garden out here. But I don't really care about the chemical makeup. And I probably would have, if I had seen it through and graduated, I probably would have ended up working for Monsanto or somebody like that, which is like a horror to me now. So no, I don't know that I was thinking about where I might locate to.
But it wasn't like you were, lived in Astoria. Would you go into New York City, and was that something that was of interest?
Oh, when I was a kid, I rode my bike down to the East River a lot and looked at the high-rises. My father worked in Manhattan, and so I was in there to visit him at work frequently. I went every Saturday afternoon to the New York Public Library on my own, beginning when I was about 9, with a nickel for each way on the subway. So yeah, I was very familiar with Manhattan. But when I graduated from Cornell, I had been in ROTC, and advanced ROTC. So when I graduated, I was also a second lieutenant in the Army. And then they ask you, this was 1961, they ask you for where you want to be. They give you a choice of branches of the service of the Army you might be in, and also locations. So my number one location was Alaska, my choice, and my number one branch was Adjutant General, which was, as the Army's translation would be, personnel or human resources work. So those two things seemed to suit me. And I was given those choices, but it was still a few months away. So before I was to report. And in the meantime, the Berlin Wall went up and the orders were changed. So I became an armor officer, tanks, in Germany instead of a personnel officer in Alaska.
Wow.
So that was a big, big change in my outlook.
And so that was pretty much right after you had graduated.
I graduated from Cornell, and within a few months, I was in Germany as the head of a tank platoon with big responsibility for tanks and trucks and jeeps and 25 people. And
would that have been west part of West Germany?
It was part of West Germany, near Mannheim.
West, and then even West Berlin, or
it was West Germany. Berlin
Germany
was entirely isolated inside East Germany. You could get to West Berlin if you went along a narrow road in a convoy, or if you flew in. And I did do that a few times.
How long were you over there?
I was in Germany for 2 years, and I learned to speak German and loved it. And I actually was glad that I had that change, because the responsibility for a platoon and for making tough decisions we went out into the countryside a lot on maneuvers, And, learning maps and learning how to move tanks around remotely from your, hollering to your other tank drivers what you're there to do. And it was a big responsibility and really prepared me well, I felt, for a mature life. So when I came out of the Army, I had a very, very strong resume with a Cornell degree in industrial and labor relations and 2 years in the Army as an officer. It was a strong resume for that time. This would have been 1962. No, 64. And so I went out into the world to see what I could fetch in the way of job offers. And I had no problem at all. I stayed with my parents, and I went into the city every day to go to personnel agencies. And I ended up with job offers, several around the country, that would have brought me to different states to work in mostly manufacturing companies at some level in labor relations. But the job offer that I had that I liked the most, it was actually the smallest dollar offer by $500. But it was the most attractive to me because it was with Pan American Airlines. And so the job was based in what just had been changed to Kennedy Airport. That's where my office was. And I was part of a group of international labor relations, was the department. And I was the low man on the totem pole. So I was given what they regarded as the least desirable area of the world to be in charge of. But that was from Istanbul to Burma.
Wow.
That was my area of responsibility. Yeah. For labor relations and all the intricacies of that. The labor laws in those different countries where we had operations, where Pan Am had operations, yeah. And cost of living studies for the different people that Pan Am had working there, including the ground workers who were native to those countries. And so for a kid who was just 25 years old, it was, to me, extremely attractive. And I just loved it. I was traveling most of the time, 80% of the time.
So you got to explore a lot.
I did. I worked in those countries, usually it was a couple of weeks to a month in each one of those places, and then back home, and then out again, and you just kept doing that. And it was really wonderful. I learned a lot.
Did you have a favorite country amongst or places you would visit out of all of the?
Actually, I went to each of them only once.
Okay.
Because I was only there for a year and a half. I'll tell you why in a second. So I went to each of the countries only once, but it was first Turkey, to Istanbul and Ankara, and then to Iran, to Syria, to I did go to Afghanistan just for a couple of days because we had a arrangement with the local Afghan airline, so I was there, and then to India and Pakistan, where I spent most of my time, and then what was then East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. So I was in all of those countries. But what changed life for me was I spent a good several weeks in Calcutta. And my mission there was to renew the labor contract with the ground workers who were baggage handlers and other very low-level things. And they were making like 6 cents a day. And they were asking in the new contract to have 8 cents a day. And I was told when I went over there, hold them back to 7. So
that was a tough situation.
Yes.
And just could be frustrating from your standpoint on seeing how other countries and their operations have cost, and then...
Yes. And my take on Calcutta particularly, it wasn't quite so true in New Delhi. I mean, it didn't slam me the way Calcutta did. The poverty was so intense, so awful. I mean, just awful. That to feel like I was on my mission was to keep those people down. It made me sick. I mean, almost physically sick. And I thought, I cannot do this. I can't pursue this line of work for the rest of my life. By that time, I had been at Pan Am for about a year and a half. And I came back from there and resigned within a week or two. I resigned, and I decided I wanted to go in the Peace Corps because I needed to find a way to just to find myself. So I did that. And because I wasn't going to another company, because I was leaving to go in the Peace Corps, when I left Pan Am, they gave me a big party, because I had, I guess by their standards, done a good job. But I knew I was in the wrong, the labor relations wasn't right for me from the corporate side. So I went in the Peace Corps and was assigned to Ecuador. So that was then another 2 years. In Ecuador, in Cuenca, which is the third largest city, I was tasked with teaching English in the grade school level, but also at the Cuenca University level, and also to businessmen who wanted to learn English. And there was the phrase "the English as a second language" didn't even exist then. So it was, that's what it was English as a second language. And I had no clue about how to do it except what my common sense told me. And so I set up programs that I created myself, provided all the visuals for, and everything. And I graduated 3 classes of people through learning English. And that was a great experience. I lived in the village. Cuenca was it was the third largest city, but it was very small and very up in the mountains and mostly surrounded by agricultural people. And so when I left the Peace Corps in 1966, 67, I had again a very good resume that now had added a year and a half in labor relations with Pan Am, and 2 years in the Peace Corps, and in training, which is what it was, designing and implementing training programs. And so again, I'm back in New York City, and out there looking for a job, and I had a good number of offers, but the one that I accepted was with a small insurance company on Wall Street to start a training and development program for them. And that's what I started to do. And that was a very positive move. That got me on my track of human development. And so I started that department for them, hired people into the department, got it running and up, and we were very good. But in about my 6th year there, I was hired away and went to do the same thing for Avon Products in Uptown Manhattan. And I was there for about 9 years, and I rose through the ranks of human resources and became the head of human resources at Avon, and then decided I had lost my way again because I was now doing things that were very administrative. I had a huge department, or several departments reporting to me, and I really liked counseling people to help them get ahead. So I went out and formed my own consulting company in human resources, specifically outplacement, which was helping people who had lost their jobs or people who companies were firing them, downsizing, and paying me very well. Thank you very much, as a consultant, to take care of those people until they were able to get themselves reemployed. And that was very, very lucrative and very satisfying.
Mm.
So I did that for the next good number of years until I retired early at age 55 and moved out here full time.
When did you start that company?
In 1980.
Oh, okay. But between that kind of the mid 60s or late 60s into the 70s.
I was at Avon all that time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you were living in New York City.
Living in New York City, different neighborhoods. You know, I hit all the neighborhoods in the process of...
What did you think of, I guess it could be more towards the 70s, but what did you think of New York at that time, New York City at that time? And obviously there were some challenges economically.
Yes, in the mid-70s,
Yes.
when Dinkins was mayor.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I mean, after John Lindsay was mayor,
Mm-hmm.
then things really went into the tank financially.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a challenging time.
And you probably saw that even with your own work that you did with labor and jobs with the economics.
My job was employment and training. So I experienced the problems of New York City more as an individual citizen and resident of Manhattan than from a job point of view.
Okay.
I guess the job market was good, so it was easy to hire people. Pretty easy during most of that time. I don't remember any difficulties. And I was always designing new training programs and new development programs within those companies. So I wasn't much affected by the economic downturns in the city. I mean, I was aware, but not really much affected. Yeah. I went, to the theater a lot. And back in the 70s, it was just fabulous. So
there's so many different venues, and it was affordable, and
yeah,
you could just whether it was off Broadway or Broadway.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. It was more affordable by far than it is now.
And then some people would talk about the environment and that it was more gritty, or in terms of crime at that time. How did you feel?
Yeah, it was...
It didn't bother you?
It didn't bother me, yeah. I mean, I was aware of it, and it was more gritty, but it just was, it wasn't horrible for me. I didn't live in luxury by any means, and I didn't live in exclusive apartment buildings. I mostly didn't. So I was very aware of it, but it never bothered me. Yeah. I guess plenty of time in Calcutta will do that for you. It all looked grand.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I can't remember how it happened, but I had come over to the North Fork once in a while just for the adventure of it. And that's what it was. People didn't know the North Fork, and it was a great adventure. And I really liked it. I liked the greater simplicity of it. I liked what I saw or experienced of the people. They felt more real. And so eventually I thought, let's take a look at some real estate. So I did, and I found a farm that had just been subdivided. And it was subdivided between, this is in South Jamesport, okay? And 9 acres of it had a house and 9 acres. And it had just been subdivided so that the 9 acres or 10 or 11, whatever it was, across Peconic Bay Boulevard on the water had been sold off to a developer. So I got the 9 acres, not on the beach, across the way, but I did have a right of way down to the beach.
Okay.
So that was kind of, in a way, when I think about it, looking back, kind of a predictor of the way things were going to go. But mine was a wooded part. It was the part on the side of the beach that had been the farm. This was the woods, and it was just beautiful, and a very old-fashioned home going back to about 1850. And I really loved it. And so again, this continued to be a weekend place, but there was a barn on the property, and I did get some goats and some chickens, and I did bring out somebody from New York. I think the barn must have had, the barn had a little residence attached to it. So I was able to find somebody in the city who was tired of being in the city, and he came out full-time and lived in the barn. He had known something about plants, but he really got himself into agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And so we built a greenhouse, and we had these animals, and he just fell into it right away.
Huh.
And so I was all of a sudden this weekend gentleman farmer with somebody who really did all of the farming work. But it satisfied that need in me, which I had always had, which was to live rural and to get my hands involved in animals and dirt and soil and all that stuff.
Yes.
So that was 1979. And I'll tell one short little story that kind of gives a perspective on the character of the North Fork back then, or one sense of the character. And then as I went to a restaurant, I was looking for a really nice restaurant to go to one weekend night, and on Manor Lane there was the, what was it called? It wasn't the Manor Lane Inn, but something like that. Everybody will know what restaurant I'm talking about. It's the only really one on Manor Lane. And so I went in there and ordered dinner from soup to nuts. And but they just started coming out in the wrong order. Like the things came either all together or they were reversed order of what they should have been. I can't remember the details. But I remember saying to the waitress, this is what happened here. And she said, and keep in mind, this was supposed to be one of the nicest restaurants on the North Fork. She said, well, sorry, but what difference does it make? It's all going to the same place anyway. And I remember thinking, even at the time, aha, this is the North Fork. This could not have happened on the South Fork. This reflects the character of the North Fork in a way that I was shocked, but I was also pleased that it was a simple kind of place. Very, very, very much in contrast with the South Fork.
Yes. No, that's interesting. But that was in Jamesport?
That was in Jamesport. Manor Lane in Jamesport, yes.
And then was it in around 1981 that you discovered the New Suffolk area? On another weekend, yeah. And remember, I'm just here weekends, usually Friday afternoon to Sunday afternoon. So on another weekend, having seen, and at that point in time, the road, Route 25, I don't remember about the North Road, but Route 25 certainly, all the way from Riverhead to Orient, there were billboards. And the two most prominent billboards, the two most frequent, were for restaurants, one in New Suffolk called the Galley Ho, and one in Southold called Armando's Seafood Barge. And they both had been there for quite some time. So I decided, okay, one Saturday about noon, I took off from South Jamesport to New Suffolk and to go to the Galley Ho and get a burger or whatever. And so I turned at where the Handy Pantry is now, made that right turn onto New Suffolk Avenue, and started down. And I very quickly, after passing a quarter mile or so of homes and farm fields, I came upon this New Suffolk Avenue went across 3 or 4 different creeks. And there was a bridge across each of those creeks. And they were wooden bridges. So that when you went across them, there was a lot of clicking and clacking of the wood under your tires. And they were maintained by the Southold Town Highway Department. And they were painted, wooden painted bridges. They were painted dark green. And at the entrance to each bridge, as you crossed, there was a sign, hand painted, said, "Slow down, Swans Crossing." And I just, I couldn't believe it. I thought, and it was beautiful. When you crossed those bridges and you looked out over the marshland to the bay, eventually as you got further down toward New Suffolk, you were looking at Robbins Island. And sure enough, there were swans crossing. And I thought, this is the place for me. This is where I want to come and spend the rest of my life. So I gradually, after the last bridge, I got down into New Suffolk. And I came to what was the intersection of First and Main, they call it down there. It's actually the intersection of New Suffolk Avenue and New Suffolk Road, one coming from Cutchogue, one coming from Riverhead, from Mattituck.
And there at that intersection on a Saturday afternoon between 12 and 1, there was a three-legged dog lying in the intersection, just lying there, sunning himself.
Mm.
And people would stop, slow down, ride around him, and kind of wave to the dog. And right there was the Galileo restaurant. And again, I said, "Oh man, this is the place that I would like to spend the rest of my life." It's just the character of it was so very me, even though I was born and raised in New York City. This just appealed to me. So I made up my mind that day that I was going to try to find a piece of real estate, something that would move me out a little further east from South Jamesport into New Suffolk. And I mentioned it to somebody along the way that I had that resolve, and they said, "Forget about it. Anything that ever comes up in New Suffolk goes very quickly, probably most likely to somebody in the family."
And this was in the early 80s.
This was 82.
Saying that.
This was 1981. I'm sorry. This is 1981. And but I had my resolve anyway. So I just kept my eye out in the ads and maybe made contact with a few real estate brokers. And finally, in the spring of 1982, about a year later, a property came up for sale in New Suffolk, downtown New Suffolk, and it was a commercial building. It had been a deli, and the owner had died, and his widow didn't want to continue to run it, and she had put the building up for sale. And I thought, well, this was not at all what I had in mind. But I did promise myself that the first piece of real estate that came up, if I could afford it, I would buy. And I remembered that promise to myself, and the cost was reasonable. And I thought, okay, I could swing this, and I'll do it. And so I did. And I got a mortgage from the woman who owned it, and we became friends. And so it all worked out. But then I had a commercial building on my hands. I had a full-time job in New York City that was very, very, very demanding. And I thought, what can I do? So again, I dipped into my contacts in New York City and found a guy who was just dying to move to the country, and he had some retail experience. And so I opened up, where the deli had been, I opened up what I called the New Suffolk Emporium. And it was a nautical gift shop. Lots of nautical tchotchkes.
Yeah.
And we have one little section of the store, which we made into an art gallery. And the woman who was president of the local artists association at the time, a very good painter, it became her kind of permanent gallery. And so off we went. It was kind of a change. So, I mean, at the same time, I'm ruining the change that is happening, but at the same time, I'm part of the change that is happening. Because what happened with the Emporium was an attractive kind of upscale for the North Fork at the time, business. And so I immediately started attracting a lot of wealthy people from Nassau Point and other communities like that, that where people with money lived. And that was it. One of the frequent customers was a woman at that time in her 80s who had just written a book called The New Suffolk Story, and it was a very well-researched but small book on the history of New Suffolk going back to the 1820s. And it was published by the Cutchogue New Suffolk Historical Council, and she kind of wanted to have a book opening, and I kind of said, hey, let's do it at the New Suffolk Emporium. And this, again, was on a Saturday afternoon, and we got wine donated. By that time, Hargrave Vineyard was 10 years old, and they were now selling wine, and they donated the wine for the event. And we had, I forget where the food came from, but we also had snacks, And so we set up outside on the street a book signing place, and this lady said, and we had hundreds of people come, and she sold many, many, many books. and everybody got very, very high on Hargrave wine, and it was just an event that people really remembered. And as a result of that, Louisa Hargrave became a good friend of mine at that point, and we've had a nice history over these past 40 years, I guess it is, and she now lives also at Peconic Landing, as I do.
Yes.
So it's just, to me, a very rich and wonderful story of my coming to the North Fork and my being here all these now, a little over 40 years, almost 45 years. Yeah.
And at the time, throughout the 80s, were you getting involved more in the community, even through the New Suffolk Waterfront?
Yes.
Was that council or fund?
We called it the New Suffolk Waterfront Fund, ultimately. But yes, Chris, amazingly, in the very early days of my opening the New Suffolk Emporium, which was, it's where Summer Girl is now. So it's right down there next to Legends, upscale. At that point, it was called Captain Ahab's, and it was just a bar, kind of a seedy bar,
yes,
which spoke to the history of New Suffolk as a waterfront, a real waterfront, mini Marseille.
Yeah.
That's what it had been. So it was a bar, a seedy bar, and a pool table. That's what Legends was then. So that's where I all of a sudden found myself. So one day, very early on, I'm standing in the New Suffolk Emporium and looking out at the nice vista, and all of a sudden, there's a little protest and a little parade of, I don't know, a dozen or a couple of dozen maybe, people with some signs, no condos, no condos. And it turned out, the New Suffolk Civic Association, which had been founded in 1969, the first and for a long time the only civic association on the North Fork. And they had organized this little protest to fight a proposal. The man who owned the North Fork shipyard, which is all what is now the New Suffolk Waterfront Fund property, he was retiring from having owned the place for 30 years, and that property included the Galley Ho restaurant, a shipyard, boat building, a little marina, etc. And he had decided it was time to retire, and he put the property up for sale. And the interest was from developers. And when the Civic Association saw that, they immediately galvanized and started protesting any building of, it would have been 27 two-story co-op buildings along that waterfront, would have totally blocked the view.
What year was that?
Downtown New Suffolk. It's still 1982.
Still 1982, okay.
So, and that was just a proposal on his part to retire and put this property up for sale. But they had a bite, and it was the bite that caused the Civic Association to jump into action. And I thought, from my little, being a total stranger to the community, I thought, okay, I want to join that association quickly. And so I did right away. I joined the association and got very involved in their activities. And I don't know, that was 82. We worked along. We successfully defeated the condo thing. We got the town. The town had always been very, very attentive to this little community, New Suffolk, and because they were organized because they had organized a civic association. For that reason, they were very attentive to them, and they listened. And they did listen to this, and, it went through a lot of procedure, but they ultimately denied the condo application. And so things kind of settled down for a while. Over the ensuing few years, there were a couple of, like there was a story in the New York Times on a Sunday that showed how beautiful New Suffolk was and showed pictures and stories of their little two marinas. And everybody thought, oh my God, it's going to happen again. And sure enough, it began to happen. There were more bites on different kinds of development in New Suffolk. But again, The Civic Association was always there and ready to fight it, and succeeded. So the property stayed vacant. The North Fork shipyard ownership remained the same, except the guy essentially retired from work, and it became quite seedy. The restaurant remained, however, but there were cars parked and old boats parked, and it looked fine to me, but a lot of people thought, doesn't look so good. So that was the status quo for a long time, for a good number of years, until the late 80s.
And also, even coming out throughout the 80s, would you go further to Southold and Greenport or Orient?
Oh, yeah, sure. First occasional trips to get to know them better,
Yeah.
Just curiosity kinds of things. And again, just the more I saw, the more I loved it, and the more I wanted to become involved. I had become a member of the Peconic Land Trust right after its founding, which was a South Fork group initially. But being that I had come from the South Fork, again, as a weekender, I really was into land preservation. And so I joined the Peconic Land Trust early on, right after its founding in 1983, and became an enthusiastic supporter right away. So, and eventually, as you know, I'm not sure what year it was, but eventually they opened an office also on the North Fork. And now they are equally in the North Fork business of land preservation as they are South Fork.
And I was just curious what you thought of Greenport at the time. Was it more, as some people have described it as, it was a little more empty and not, I don't know if I would say run down, but just seemed like it might have been going through a tough period?
Well, yeah, it was not seedy rundown by any means.
Because you were still living in New York City, and there were probably seedier parts within Manhattan.
That's not a fair comparison by any means. but Greenport, I always liked it. Again, it had charm and flavor to me.
Yeah.
It had flavor and it was funky. That's the word I haven't used so far. I love the word funky. I don't know why, where it came from, my love of funky. But New Suffolk was funky. South Jamesport was funky. Southold was not funky. Southold was always kind of a little bit more refined.
Refined.
Yes, more refined. Nothing going on, but refined. Greenport, again, you go back to funky. So it wasn't seedy, but it was funky. You knew that there were characters there. Loads of characters of all different kinds. And I liked that right away.
Okay.
So, restaurants to me are a good measure, I think, of a place's development. And I mentioned before the Jamesport Manor Inn. That was the name of the one on Jamesport, on Manor Lane in Jamesport. Jamesport Manor Inn. And then there was the La Gazelle in Southold, which was regarded as a fine French restaurant. And indeed it was. And then the next thing was in Greenport, there was what still exists on the water there.
Not Claudio's?
Claudio's.
Yeah.
It was Claudio's. That was really about it.
Yeah.
If you wanted kind of a good name restaurant, there were other little holes in the wall, but not much.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't enough patronage for any more than that. So if you were going out to dinner and you wanted it to be a little bit special, you either went to the Jamesport Manor Inn, the La Gazelle, which is now North Fork Table and Inn in Southold, or Claudio's, which is still Claudio's.
Yeah.
But all the others that you could name either didn't exist or were constantly turning over.
And also, I was going to ask just a little bit of the history of during the New Suffolk Waterfront, a little bit of the history of that area. And was it like a busy port at some point?
Oh, history-wise.
Going back.
Yes. New Suffolk has a very, very interesting nautical history. Very interesting. I say nautical, I mean related to the businesses you could do on the water. Very interesting. Beginning right from the beginning, there were people from Cutchogue who came down to New Suffolk and established a port in like 1830. And they were importing from New England or coal. And I'm trying to think what other goods, but coal mostly, and exporting out of New Suffolk potatoes that came down from the Cutchogue and surrounding farms, and some other agricultural products. But that was how New Suffolk got started. And there had been farmland that stretched down from Cutchogue as far as the wetlands, and then a big stretch of nothing. But one road got built down what is now Old Harbor Road, called Old Harbor Road, down to what is now the New Suffolk Waterfront, and so there was always that commercial, and then around that commercial activity, there grew up a couple of bars and a store. And bad actors, the way, again, I said mini Marseille before. I've never been to Marseille, but I've read enough about it to know that where seamen are, there's always going to be
some activities.
That's right. Yeah. So you had pool halls, you had some houses of ill repute, you had gambling in the streets, and loads of drinking. So that even up until the time I came to New Suffolk, it had just begun to ease off a little bit. But there were stories of people slightly older than I who said when they were kids that their parents absolutely forbid them to go downtown New Suffolk because it was dangerous and immoral, and you just didn't want to go there. So
it's interesting because I would hear that about Greenport, but the people, I don't hear that about you don't hear
because New Suffolk is so much smaller. Yes. But it was similar in Greenport for sure. Yeah. I mean, but Greenport always had more, whereas with New Suffolk, that was really all there was that downtown waterfront activity. That was it, and associated bars and a little grocery store and a bait shop and stuff like that. New Suffolk is a much smaller entity, but Greenport had that same waterfront character, but it also had a lot more to it. It was a bigger community. It was also in the oyster business, which was big. So New Suffolk also was in the oyster business, and we had, when I first went there, there were oyster shacks, and there was a big oyster factory. It was defunct at the time, abandoned, but it was there. And again, in my early years, going back to the mid-'80s, these attempts to develop it somehow or other led to the old buildings, which were inactive, one at a time burning down. Always, of course, by an act of God, but not really, I'm sure. There were people trying to clear up the situation so that they could develop and build. Well, luckily, thanks to the Waterfront Fund, which was an organization that grew out of the New Suffolk Civic Association, but thanks to that, the development never happened, and still hasn't happened to this day. We are now, the New Suffolk Waterfront Fund, we are now a 501c3 nonprofit organization that owns the waterfront and manages it for the benefit of the community.
No, that's wonderful, because I think around the same time, linking with Greenport, there were the abandoned fisheries and oyster factories that were also not being used, and I think the village ended up developing that into condominiums.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. There are like 3 condominium projects that are on the waterfront here in Greenport. That's exactly right, and that they resulted from the same kind of thing that the old was starting to disappear culturally, and then physically. Culturally, there were less people coming out for recreational fishing, and so the buildings that supported them declined. They became decrepit. They burned down or got knocked down, and then eventually condos, which was the obvious thing. So we would have had a set of condos like the ones you see here in Greenport in New Suffolk.
Right on the water.
Right on the water. Wherever they were built, blocking views for the rest of people.
Do you think, I mean, at the time, I guess there wasn't anything else they could do within Greenport, but it would have been better in the end to try to keep that open instead of developing these things.
In my opinion, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like most waterfront development, any place, just even for the sake of the threats of weather and storms.
Yeah.
It would have been better off. But that aside, forgetting about that for a minute, even for the sake of
open views,
open access, you close off access when you develop a waterfront that way. You close off access immediately. Everybody has a sign. Every one of those condo communities in Greenport, you'll see a sign as you get to it. No trespassing private property. Every one of them. You go down to New Suffolk, you don't see anything like that.
And going into the 80s, I mean, not the 80s, going into the 90s, were there other attempts?
There were many other attempts.
90s, 2000s, 2000s.
Well, at first, in the early 90s, I got active in the Civic Association and gradually more and more active, and became an officer. And by about 1988 or so, I was asked to be president, and I said, maybe 1990, asked to be president of it, and I just didn't want to do that because I was still a weekender from New York, and I didn't think it was right that I should be president of the New Suffolk Civic Association. It would cause a lot of bad feelings on the part of the New Suffolk people who lived here full time. So, but I was very active. I became vice president, and I was very active. And one of the things that I was preaching was, at all costs, but I wasn't the only one preaching it, and I wasn't the first one, but I was preaching, this space has got to stay open. This downtown New Suffolk, it's going to make such a difference to the future if we manage to keep it open. And again, because of the strength of the Civic Association at Town Hall, that we were very fortunate. Very fortunate. So it was important to keep that alive. So in the early 90s, the threats continued and they grew. So there was another big one. The big one was to develop the New Suffolk Marina. And it turns out that property, the waterfront, owns, unlike most other waterfront properties, it owns underwater property out 650 feet into the bay is part of the deed. Most other deeds, they go down to the waterfront, to the high tide line. But in this case, it was got to do with the King's Grant back in the 1600s. The King's Grant included in that case, I'm not sure why, this I forget what they call it, riparian rights or something to the water, which is ultimately what made New Suffolk a great port for oystering and scalloping and all the scallop shacks and oyster shacks that lined the waterfront in the early days. So because of these riparian rights that went way out into the water, there was a proposal by some big outfit from Nassau County developers to build a gigantic marina and a hotel and a conference center and restaurant. It was like mind-boggling to us who had been involved in protesting at Town Hall for a good number of years at that point, protesting condo developments. It was peanuts compared to what this was, and we really had to mount. I mean, we had to elevate ourselves along with the elevation and the concepts for what that waterfront could be developed to be. So again, brought all of our strength to Town Hall. But at that point, there's an architect on the North Fork who just recently retired. He and his wife owned a firm called Samuels and Steelman. And Tom Samuels was on the board with me of the Civic Association. And, we chatted about this threat. And that's when we first came up with the idea. We came up with the idea of these developers just don't get it. They don't get what the New Suffolk community is and what it wants itself to be. And so maybe what we should do, instead of just protesting all the time, maybe we should talk in the affirmative. Here's what we would accept or what we do think fits as a New Suffolk waterfront development. And so Tom, God bless him, and his wife Nancy, they put out plans to these developers to say, here's what we could live with. No protests. And the developers looked at it and said, thank you very much, but we can't sink all this money into that property if that's only as big as it's going to be. We wouldn't make our money back.
What was it? What was the plan that?
It was just a scaling back.
Just scaling back?
Scaling back of what they were proposing.
But they said it was too small.
It was too small.
Yeah.
And I think we did that twice. We scaled it back once, and they kind of went for it, and then I can't remember the detail, but Tom ended up giving them two proposals, one larger and then another one smaller. But it was when the smaller one came in, they finally said, no way could they make any money. And that's when we got the brainstorm. And I'm not sure exactly what year that was, but it was the early 90s. It was sometime between 1990 and 1995 that we got the idea, look, if any developer is not going to be able to buy this property because we're going to be protesting all the time and they're never going to be able to build anything that would get them their money back, then maybe what we got to have our sights on long term is owning the property ourselves. Because it can't sit forever becoming more and more decrepit, because people were beginning to be anxious about that. I thought it was great funky, but most people thought looks like hell.
They wanted to.
So we had to do something.
Yeah.
But we had to do something that wouldn't change the character of the community. So we created a committee of the New Suffolk Waterfront. Of the New Suffolk Civic Association. We created a committee. It was called the Waterfront Committee to, number one, continue to monitor any development proposals that came into Town Hall. And we did. We sent this committee up, and they were coming in fast and furious then. This, that, and the other. And the committee kept on top of it. And finally, somewhere around 2004 or 5, we formed the New Suffolk Waterfront Fund. And essentially, the first people who were on the board of that, it was a separate board, the first people on the board of that were the people who had most recently formed the committee, the Waterfront Committee of the Civic Association. So without the Civic Association, there would never have been a Waterfront Fund. And without the Waterfront Fund, anything could have happened down there.
And looking at it today, is it now basically preserved as open space?
It is open space, with the exception of the restaurant, which had always been there, which after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 had to be moved back and raised 8 feet, maybe 5 to 8 feet, had to be raised. So that's what's there. But except for that, it is open. And this was a recent project of 3 years ago, rebuilt what had been the ancient steamboat pier. It had all crumbled and decrepit. This goes back to the 1830s when it was first built. It had just become a line of rocks. 38 hurricane, blah, 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 gradually, and then suddenly just disappeared. So it was a line of rocks that you wouldn't know what it had been. But we knew from historical documents that, we had at the Cutchogue, New Suffolk Historical, at the library. And so we decided that was a major fundraising project for us down in New Suffolk, was to raise the money to rebuild this pier. And we did. And it still doesn't look like a pier. It looks like a big jetty that goes out into the water, but all rocks, all well supported. And eventually we have historic signage and some landscaping, which will finish it off. But at the end of that pier now, people come to fish. People from all over come to fish. And it's just a beautiful thing. We have classes down there for kids learning to fish and learning about water quality and farming of oysters and scallops and all of that is educational classes that are going on down there off that pier.
No, I think that's a wonderful thing to see something like that come to fruition from the 80s to the 90s of possibly not happening. So that's a wonderful example. I think good for people to hear throughout the North Fork, because I think we're always dealing with that in other areas.
Yes. Well, people have seen and heard and learned, because now there is a total proliferation of civic associations.
Mm-hmm.
You have a civic association in every town and village on the North Fork.
Yeah.
But that is very recent. So it is a wonderful story. My experience is mostly about New Suffolk and that development. And my involvement goes on, even though I think I told you I still go weekends to New Suffolk. I have a cottage there that when I moved to New Suffolk 22 years ago, when I moved to Greenport, to Peconic Landing, 22 years ago, I kept a little cottage that I had previously rented down in New Suffolk, and I, took it over for myself. And so I still go down there and keep myself involved also in New Suffolk. But during all of those years, I was getting to know the rest of the North Fork better. But I know New Suffolk best.
Yes. And I think it would be interesting to talk about, because you had retired out here in the 90s, but was it 2002 with Peconic Landing? Could you just talk a little bit about that and how you got involved with Peconic Landing and that development?
Yeah.
Because
I wasn't involved with the development of it.
No, not the development.
But the early occupation.
Yeah, early occupation.
Yeah. Well, I retired from full-time. I had my own firm ultimately in Manhattan, and I retired from that. Fortunately, when I was 55, which was 1993, I sold the business, had enough money, I thought I could finally realize my dream of moving to the country full-time. Well, I sold my business, sold my apartment in the city, and moved out here full-time. And at first, bought a house on Grasswell Road and fixed it up to be appropriate for full-time. And then after a few years there, 88, I bought it in 88. So I was a weekender there actually for a while. And then when 93 came and I thought, okay, I'm going to go out there and live full time, there were 2 lots that came up available and I bought them and built a dream home kind of thing. And then so my partner and I built that house. In many of these things that I've mentioned, like the New Suffolk Emporium, for example, my partner was there helping and supporting, not quite as involved as I was, but helping and supporting. So he was going to be able to retire at about the same time I was. He was older, 6 or 7 years older, but he was going to be able to retire. So we retired out here. We finally established ourselves in New Suffolk into a home we had built in 1994. So we were now full-time out here. We had 4 acres in New Suffolk. We were thought of ourselves now as gentlemen farmers. We were in the woods. We were in the gardens and walking the vineyards, which had proliferated by that time, walking the vineyards with our dogs, and it was a good life. And then in 1999, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And at about the same time, by 2000, I think it was, we heard that out here in Greenport, this Peconic, so many Peconics in my life.
Peconic Landing.
The Peconic Landing was developing as a full-time life care community, which is a staged thing. You go from independent living to nursing home if you need it. So we thought that made sense. So even though we had been in our dream home for 8 years, we decided we're going to sell it and move to Peconic Landing when it opens. And we did that. And I'm very proud to say we never looked back. We never said, oh, poor us. You got sick and we had to move. We just didn't look back. We had nice memories and we loved Peconic Landing right from the beginning. And his Parkinson's gradually got worse, but it isn't the worst case that I know of by any means. And he died in 2015. But he had been there, and we had a nice life for 13 years. So it's all very, very positive. And so, as is characteristic of me, I got very involved in Peconic Landing. And I actually, because so many things there are taken care of that you don't need to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Like feeding yourself and calling somebody if the toilet breaks and all that kind of stuff. I realized very, very quickly, well, this isn't anything that I was ever accustomed to. I'm accustomed to using all of the time and the energy to do things for myself. And all of a sudden I realized I don't need to expend my energy that way. I can't even expend it because... So I decided I had to reinvent myself. And so I got into writing, which led me into literature, which I had really not had enough of in college, and more history and more. So I ended up teaching in our lifetime learning program, and I've been doing it since 2003. And so I teach and I write columns, and I wrote a book called Crazy About Words, and so I've come to be known as something totally different than I ever was before. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And yeah, just seeing you've gotten to see Peconic Landing even develop from the beginning and grow, and just, you mentioned that you're involved in a lot of the community events there, and I guess even thinking of other people that, not that you want it to be an advertising thing, but just in terms of other people and that might be interested in Peconic Landing, like your overall experience since 2002.
Right. Well, very, very positive. I helped. I was on the initial board of directors of the Lifetime Learning Association at Peconic Landing, and as I said, I lent myself teaching in that to something that was totally new to me, but I learned and developed. And also, I became involved in a lot of things. For example, the reason I was late for this meeting today, I had to be late, is because at 11 o'clock, they were taking a group photo of the people who are called Peconic Landing ambassadors, of which I have been one for a long time. And they are essentially working with the marketing department.
Okay.
To put the word out, to meet with people when we have group meetings, or to meet individually with people, and help spread the word, and to help sell Peconic Landing. So yes, I've been involved in that.
Yes. And for someone who's been out here and continues to be involved in the community, especially at Peconic Landing, what advice or wisdom would you give to someone younger starting out today, based on your experiences of staying active and engaged throughout your life?
I would say, I would recommend people to always be aware of what they like to do, what they're interested in, and to be guided by that at any age. And ideally, if we're aware of ourselves, we will notice that those things change from time to time. And so we should be changing. I think the model that has been presented to us over the last many generations really is that you go into some career thing and you stay with that, and then you retire. So life is divided into education, career, and then retirement. But within education and career and retirement, there are really, really multiple options, and they can best be ferreted out by going inside yourself and saying, what is it I like to do? And so if you're absolutely nowhere and you ask yourself that question, obviously it's a very basic question. If you're already doing something that generally speaking you like, but maybe you haven't hit the specific right thing, then ask yourself that question, what do I like, within the context of where you are. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that has been a guide to me. Really, since college, I would go and do something and then find that I did not like it, and probably with some advice, or at least some thought, would make a change. So it's so important for people not to worry or hesitate to make changes, because changes are good, just the way mistakes are good. And a lot of times we make a change based on a recognized mistake that we made.
Yes.
So
I'm thinking even with people today going into different fields, and I think it's harder to, because I think even personally with myself, thinking what I might have been passionate about in my early 20s with more of the arts, but then within our economy and everything, is that doable? And whether I'm passionate about it enough, I found something else that I was passionate about within the libraries that was more stable
Right.
in a way. But I think still for young people today trying to balance their careers, because I think they might be going into more where it is more of a stable job market if it's certain areas where it may be more within the business or medical, or I don't know if they're picking more this might be getting off
Picking more of the stable things.
yes, more of the stable things instead of maybe less of the humanities or the arts.
Oh, well, it depends on what you mean by stable. But, I mean, for example, just from yesterday, from this Trailblazers and Pathfinders conference that we held at Peconic Landing, and they were all seniors from the North Fork high schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say altogether maybe 100 kids in the auditorium with, a third of that many of residents from Peconic Landing acting as guides and counselors,
Mm-hmm.
and some North Fork business owners also
Mm-hmm.
were among the mix, and we had broken down into tables. But I would say, from that experience yesterday, the kids are plenty aware that change will be the name of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they really believe that or not, or whether they think once they make a decision, I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more of what they've been told. You're going to have a lot of changes in your lifetime, unlike your parents who were able to go into one thing. But they don't seem to be afraid about that. Nobody says, "Oh, I want something that'll last me my whole life." So it's just interesting to see how they would develop.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would say the same thing, and I counsel a lot of people very informally because it was my background, it was my career, was counseling about what you do. Mm-hmm. Originally, it was about what you do for work. Mm-hmm. Later on, it was about what you do for extracurricular activities and for pro bono work, for example. So I still do a lot of work at Peconic Landing, and people have the same thing there. There's so many volunteer opportunities, I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. Get back inside yourself. Mm-hmm. And don't run to just what seems to be popular thing to do. Mm-hmm. But think about what's available and think about how that might suit you and go there. For example, right now, because of the fact that CAST, as you know, has had a big renaissance in the last couple of years. They bought this opera house. They bought the opera house in South Old, the old church, which became an opera house, which then CAST bought. They were able to expand all of their programs tremendously. So everybody thinks of volunteer opportunities. Everybody thinks of CAST first. But when they say that, I say, wait a minute, slow down. Let's find out exactly what CAST does and what the opportunities are. And I would say in half the cases, they recognize there's probably other things that they would really enjoy more. And it's not to put CAST down at all. They're doing a fabulous job. But everybody's kind of running to it because it's the nonprofit opportunity of the month, or of the year. So, but there's so many opportunities out here for volunteer work. Not just out here, but in the world generally. Volunteer work is just developed tremendously and interesting stuff.
No, I think that's important for people of all ages to stay involved. And there's plenty of things, even if you're just doing it for a little bit, whether it's a week or a month, within the month.
Yes. Another big opportunity out here for work is to work with immigrants. Because there are more and more and more immigrants over the past few years, past 20 years. And more of them are, not legal. And those problems for them are going to keep coming up in the near future. But there's also lots of opportunity there to work and to help and to really help bring people along. Counseling in terms of how they handle their family, as well as what kind of work they do. CAST is doing a good job in that regard in terms of educating people in education, especially in things like food services, which happens to be growing out here like crazy.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Definitely. Oh, and then I had two other questions related specifically towards the North Fork. But looking at when you first came out here and until now, what do you enjoy? What have you enjoyed most about living out here and being involved in the community?
Well, I guess I would have to say, it sounds like a cliche, and it certainly is. It's more like the great outdoors, and you have space to do things. I've never done anything like personally done farming. Well, I did for a few summers when I was in high school and college, but I've never career-wise done any farming. So it's not like I have spent many days working outdoors, but I spend as much time out here outdoors as it's possible to do. When I first came to the North Fork in about 1980, there was very few places to walk. That sounds funny. There were some trails, but very few. So I did most of my walking on the farms and the vineyards. If I'd get asked or challenged, I would talk to the landowner, and invariably they agreed, sure, just help yourself. But then over the last 40 years, gradually over time, there have been many more preserves, preserved land, and many, many more preserves and trails and to visit and hike on. So that's one of the delights for me about living on the North Fork. The other thing I would say is that the people are varied in terms of their background, and they're varied in terms of their approach to life. It feels like not a homogeneous population. It feels, and I think the people tend to be, as they frequently are in rural communities, they tend to be more real, more practical, more based on everyday living needs. And I really like that. So let me put it this way. There's very little pretension.
That was something you might have seen more when in Manhattan a bit?
Everybody was totally pretentious. They didn't even realize it about themselves, how pretentious they were. But out here, the pretentious person is much more the minority who stands out, whereas the non-pretentious person is somebody you have to get to know and then decide, will I take them for who they are? Because they're not going to change much. They are who they are.
Yes.
So.
No, I can see that.
Yeah. Do you by any chance know the writings of Wendell Berry?
No.
No. You might look him up.
Okay.
Wendell Berry. He's now 90, maybe even a couple of years older than that. Wendell Berry, Berry. He is a Kentucky philosopher, poet, and farmer from, I don't know, somewhere 60 miles outside of Louisville. He's won every kind of writing prize you can imagine. And he's just short stories, prose, fiction, poetry. He's just marvelous. And he essentially says the same thing, that when people are more community, there's another word I really want to use, there's community here. Much more than in the Hamptons, for example. There's still community here. And when people live in what they really can really feel is community, there tends to be a richness about life. It doesn't exist where everybody's doing their own thing.
Yes.
In Manhattan, you can sense community, but only from a very broad sense, not in terms of everyday life. Here, it's everyday life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see it more where I think it might be more isolated or in little bits, little communities here and there.
Yes.
Within the city. Whereas I think here it's much more broader.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's isolated little communities in the city,
Mm-hmm.
and only for some people who find it, choose it, and
Mm-hmm.
make that their focus.
Yes. And then speaking of that, and within that, the last question I had was more, what are your hopes for the future of the community, and the future of the North Fork and its community down the line?
Well, I think what this place will be like is very much dictated by economic circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I put that first. There's a lot of things that come up very quickly as second that are important. The economic circumstances I'm talking about are, I believe that in the future we are going to need and value finding out and doing for ourselves much more than we have been doing up until now. In terms of feeding ourselves is the thing that's utmost on my mind when I say that. Because I think the big mass food production that we're seeing now is got plenty of problems. It's got plenty of problems. And so I think we already are realizing on the North Fork, and it's certainly talked about a lot, it is talked about, that we are in some way, nobody says the wave of the future, but that's really what they're saying, is that we have still the opportunity to keep enough land open to create niche farming that will largely feed us. Number one, for our health and nutrition, but number two, for our delight. Now, the North Fork has changed from the late 70s, 80, when I got here, from pretty much a mono agriculture to a already very diversified agriculture. Very diversified. And that's true both of things that grow in the soil as well as husbandry of animals. I mean, when I first came here, unbelievably, there wasn't a cow on the North Fork. There were a handful of chickens. They had just gone the way of everything else. Everything was potatoes and strawberries. That was it.
Yeah.
No animals, no horse farms, no dairy farms, no beef farms, no goats, no sheep. And now, all you have to do is drive from Riverhead to Orient Point, and you will see plenty of animals. And not just grazing and being raised in the fields, but also in niche places where you can purchase meat, like Sangli and Eight Hands Farm, and those places are gradually, and every year they're more numerous. So to me, that's a part of the wave of the future. And one thing I support big time is I've been a supporter of the Peconic Land Trust since they started on the South Fork in 1983. In the last, I'm not sure exactly how many years ago, but fairly recent past, they started an initiative which has grown in terms of its importance, and it's captivating the imagination of potential members and donors to the Peconic Land Trust, and that is, they call it Farms for the Future. And I think that's a very important thing. And I have I now support that big time. I just received an email this morning from somebody at Peconic Land Trust asking if I would come and go on a tour sometime in December of recent land acquisitions by the Peconic Land Trust that will be turned into agricultural land. I mean, that will go back to agricultural land and to for the raising of crops. And they're doing a marvelous job. They are actually recruiting younger people to learn how to farm and to try to experiment in terms of their own, do they like this? With small things like mushrooms. I don't know if you heard about, Peconic Land Trust talked to these young couple who said they'd be interested in mushrooms. And they have become a big powerhouse in the mushroom business on a relatively small amount of land. And that the same thing is true of other crops. And there's a Japanese man out here. He's like in his late 60s. And he raises, I'm trying to remember what his product is, but he has like less than an acre. and he raises, what the heck is it? It's some kind of vegetable.
Yeah.
Not mushrooms. It's not microgreens. Maybe it is microgreens.
Yeah.
That he is making a living for himself and his wife in their late 60s selling these microgreens to market in New York City. So you're having farms, agriculture farms, you're having animal husbandry increasing, and of course you're having now the reclaiming of the waters. It's a struggle and it's very hard. But we now have an oyster business that just not so many years ago didn't exist. And all of that is being worked on. So to me, that's a large part of the future of the North Fork. And, working against that are land developers who want to just build houses and or make this like the Hamptons, which there will be some of that. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we've got incredible beaches and,
it's hard to stop. I mean, you can kind of slow it down, but we're kind of the last place on Long Island that we've held off on a lot of development.
Yes.
And I guess it's natural within our economy for people to want to invest or make money on that. But
sure,
we also have the North Fork's unique in that everything else has really been developed. So it's almost like preserving and while still trying to make sure we keep a diverse range of
balance,
people.
Yes.
Because it can stay the way it is, but we might it might become more just a certain bracket in terms of economic bracket of people where it could just be an extreme level of wealth and then you might have low income for people just to work on certain areas out here for the people.
Well, that's the kind of stereotype that we get. But when you look carefully, that doesn't have to be that way. And this is all directional at this point. There's tug of wars going on,
Yes.
Tugs of war. But I think the dynamics of the population and the dynamics of the efforts that are being made on so many different fronts is in our favor because of the times versus, what has already happened on the South Fork. Although the South Fork is still very, very beautiful. The Peconic Land Trust impact will be greater on the North Fork than it was on the South Fork in terms of development. Just because everybody realized that without the kind of preservation the Peconic Land Trust can help create, but also the villages and the towns have also got into the preservation business where they weren't into that at all 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And of course the vineyards also make a big difference in terms of the labor required, the problem with housing, that all of the workers who come, problems with immigration, but they're all being worked on at the same time by a very diverse population.
Yes.
So I think it's exciting.
Yes.
I don't think we need to worry that just in one fell swoop, all of a sudden developers are going to come in and make houses out of it all the way they did in Nassau County and Western Suffolk County. I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
And yet I think also it won't be just a bunch of very, very rich people, taking over everything. I don't see that either. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff going on for here and for the near-term future, the rest of this century, for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. So to me, that's an exciting thing to keep an eye on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So for all those reasons, I love living here. I love the hiking. I love the beaches. I love the big space and fresh air. And I like the diversity of the population. I really do.
And then usually just at the end, I like to ask if there was any other things you would want to touch on or that we hadn't talked about, or just any other last minute things you'd like to say.
That we hadn't talked about.
Yeah. We covered a lot from the last, we covered your whole life.
Yes. Yeah, we have. Yeah. Well, one of the things I frequently count as my blessings are the fact that every little village here on the North Fork has got a surprisingly fabulous library. Like beginning with this one and heading west. It's incredible. Every single village has got a library.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. That is outstanding for what you might expect in that community.
And so I think Long Island and Suffolk County in general has a lot more libraries compared to other parts of the country.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I think a lot of other towns or cities have to rely on the city to provide a branch out there, whereas all of these are separate within a village or town, which is pretty amazing that it's still going like that.
Yes, it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And they just seem to get better and stronger and in ways that you really, at a first glance, would not expect.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, not speaking for the libraries, but I think they are also kind of a community space as well for people to come to and hopefully feel welcomed and can gather here and be involved with other people interacting and communicating.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. These kids yesterday that I met, I was quite surprised how optimistic they are about life in general. Mm-hmm. But of course, when you're 18, that's what they were all 18ish. They were all high school seniors now halfway through.
Yeah.
But, and they may not have been representative of their entire class. Probably not. But I was just impressed how optimistic they are about themselves and their opportunities, generally speaking. And I didn't get the impression that they could hardly wait to get away from the North Fork. They all wanted to go away to school. Yeah. I shouldn't say they all, but most of them really want to go away to school, which is a healthy thing.
Yeah, that's usually natural.
But none of them indicated in any way, even jokingly, that they could turn their backs on the North Fork and never come back. Whereas I think 20 years or 30 years ago, you might have had a lot of that.
Yes.
So to me, that speaks to the same thing, that there's maybe more positive outlook. But at the same time there's positive outlook, you also have to look within yourself to say, how can I fit in to this emerging idea of what the outlook for the North Fork might be? It takes more work, takes more thought, perhaps more counseling and guidance and advice. But I believe that it's there.
Yeah. No, so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story. It was really nice to talk with you and then see all the wonderful work you're still doing in the community, and especially when you came out here earlier with New Suffolk, and you mentioned in the previous interview, I made my way out there for the first time in October, and it was really nice. And and that goes to show a lot of the work you did with preserving that area.
Yeah.
But I think and then all the work you're doing at Peconic is amazing. So it was really nice to have you on today.
Good. I'm so glad. I'm really glad.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Yeah.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 106 with Joe McKay. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.